Stacy Herbert, welcome on stage.
Ah! Yeah! Who bought the fucking dip last night? No? Nobody? Well, I did, so I may need yet another tragic surfing accident. I had one out in Alzante. I'm going to keep this here just in case anybody wants to join me for a surfing accident later. Also, our guest, Sam Bankman Fried, was unable to make it here to El Salvador, which is unfortunate because I know the average net worth in this room is about $0 because we all have our boating accidents and our tragic surfing accidents and stuff. Sam has yet to have, in all of the reading I've read about him online, he hasn't yet had a tragic boating accident. So the net worth in this room would have gone up to $44 million each. I'm going to bring onto the stage right now Sam Bankman Fried. Welcome to El Salvador.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm wearing my royal fucking new time, all-time highness wig in case we have any sort of technical issues here. Now, Sam, the one thing I was reading about you on Forbes and various mainstream media, and they mention your wealth, they mention your charity, and they mention that you sleep in beanbags. Is this true?
I do often.
Well, you know, San Salvador is the valley of the hammocks, so I'm sorry that you did not come here to learn how to sleep in something a little bit more comfortable, which is the hammock. So you first entered the Bitcoin space in 2017, and over the past day here, we've been covering everybody's journey. Everybody from back to 2009 came into Bitcoin for a different reason. Yours is quite interesting because I remember those days of those massive arbitrage between exchanges. So tell us your story, what you saw that brought you into Bitcoin.
Yeah, totally. And when I first sort of got involved, I basically didn't know what a Bitcoin was. I would like to think that I do now, but I went in fairly ignorant about this space. But what drew me in first was just, there's sort of a lot of signs from the outside that there is like enormous demand, enormous activity, huge amounts of volume and volatility, and just the amount of chatter going on about Bitcoin was enormous. But none of the institutions were getting involved yet. It sort of seemed like they would probably do so eventually, but they hadn't. And what that means is that you're like pretty likely to be in a world where there's absolute large amounts of liquidity demanded and very little supply. You'd have countries start buying huge amounts of Bitcoin, and there just would not be anyone ready there to supply that. And so you'd see 5, 10, 15% divergences between Bitcoin prices across different jurisdictions where the supply was versus where the demand was. And that seemed like an opportunity to do those arbitrages and transport the Bitcoin story that needed to get.
Right. So hedge fund sorts saw these huge arbitrages, the gaps in prices, huge gaps in prices between the various exchanges around the world. Obviously, they were more able to come in and close. With the development of the derivatives market in Bitcoin, has that opportunity for free profits essentially disappeared for you? Is it more difficult now?
Yeah, it hasn't fully disappeared, but it's definitely smaller. I think that, in 2017, 2018, you would see percent arbitrages sometime for months. Now if you see a 10 basis point arbitrage, a tenth of a percent, that's like a real trade. And so everything is just compressed by a factor of, to 10 to 100. But on the other hand, I thought there was large volume trading crypto in 2017, 2018. We were hitting billions a day of global volume. In the last day, there's been $280 billion of volume across the crypto ecosystem, which is absolutely massive. And so while the spreads have come in, the scale has gone up.
Right. So let's talk about the Genesis block relating to these derivatives. Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. Back in 2008-9, we saw the global financial crash. We saw the introduction. The word of the year at that time was CDO. Everybody was introduced to derivatives and what they are alleged to have caused to the financial system. Now we see a huge derivatives market, including FTX, in the Bitcoin derivative space. What is your defense of the derivative space? You've obviously seen a lot of people talking about it as a negative, so why does Bitcoin need a derivatives industry?
Yeah, so there are a few things. First of all, like, why have it in the first place? Price discovery. So how much would a Bitcoin be worth today if there had never been any derivatives? I think a lot less. And why is that? Well, what do we see all over the crypto ecosystem right now? We see huge demand, and we actually have not had enough capital to fill that demand for a while. You've seen years go by in which large swaths of the world are expecting lots of adoption of blockchain, of Bitcoin, are sort of trying to accumulate more, but it's sort of cut off from the traditional financial rails, right? Like, when this has happened with stocks, there's trillions of dollars of balance sheet that can be flexed over from the major banks with, like, basically zero borrow. And that can create massive, fast flow to places that are demanding them. For better or for worse, and probably for worse, the crypto industry has been cut off from a lot of that. It's really hard to get financing. And so what you've seen is massive pent-up demand. And without derivatives, it would have been actually quite a bit harder to realize that nearly as efficiently or quickly, and you have had just like long periods of time. But everyone's like, yeah, obviously this is going to get twice as much tomorrow, but like nothing I can do about it. And capital efficiency of derivatives, I think, does help price discovery happen much faster. And I think that it's brought forward quite a bit of the excitement of blockchain and Bitcoin that would not be as apparent to, I think, a lot of the world were it not for that. And it also helps to generally increase liquidity in markets, which means that, it's one of the reasons that people in Japan no longer have to pay 10% more than people in America to buy a Bitcoin, because lots of hedging instruments allow for efficient liquidity providing. So I think that's the second piece. And then I'll say one last thing, which is that if you look at the things that really did damage in 2008, they weren't exchange-listed contracts. There were a lot of bespoke OTC sort of derivative-like things, and they got repackaged, and people ended up levering up without anyone even knowing. Because there's no central clearing, there's no transparency. There's no centralized process doing this. There's no public ledger, or even from a decentralized perspective, recording any of these. You had no idea how many swaps JP Morgan had on, and you had no backing those with other correlated swaps. And so I think that that's another thing that we actually sort of think is a healthy development of crypto, is all these liquidations, all these margin calls. It's not that they don't happen anymore, right? They've been brought into the light so that the whole world can see what's going on in the ecosystem. And I think that transparency is actually quite important for making sure that, we don't go over.
Sure, and obviously that sort of liquidity, but also the ability to hedge is quite important for the institutions and hyper-Bitcoinization to even happen at that scale of the nation state or institutional level. But it also did bring in your sort of colleagues in that hedge fund industry, like Paul Tudor Jones, Stan Druckenmiller, and Stan Druckenmiller related a conversation he had with Paul Tudor Jones of why he got involved in Bitcoin. And I want to know if your journey, the arbitrage opportunity is what first drew your attention to the space. But when you listen to Paul Tudor Jones or when you listen to Stan Druckenmiller now, they are like full Bitcoin cult members. They're talking about the, all the qualities of Bitcoin that the people in this room, the Bitcoin maximalists, would adhere to. But Paul Tudor Jones mentioned something about like when Bitcoin had fallen to $3,000 from, I don't know, like $15,000 in March. He said something like, to Stan Druckenmiller, that something like 85% of the people never sold a single Bitcoin during that whole crash. And he thought this was the most amazing market that he had ever seen. What do you think when you hear Paul Tudor Jones and Stan Druckenmiller and how they talk about Bitcoin? Is that your sort of evolution as well as how you look at Bitcoiners?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't see why I needed cryptocurrency until I started to get involved in the field. And, so I was doing these arbitrages. And, one of the first things that I had to do was how to, get money from like a bank account to a crypto exchange. And that was one step of like this arbitrage process. And back in 2017, the crypto exchanges were not sufficient. They had a lot of problems. Like they're really not working very well. But still, the hardest part of the crypto arbitrage was not the crypto. It was the bank. It was any time that you get in a bank that took up 2/3 of the total difficulty. And you're participating in one of the spaces that relies on it the least. And it was still the hard part. And that was when I was trying to send it from a US account to a US exchange. Trying to do it internationally. I mean, it basically doesn't work. And like as I started having to actually get acquainted with the financial system and with the rails that underpin it, it became sort of like increasingly clear that like, I mean, this is a system that was developed before the internet existed, right? Like this is not simply digital systems, they're websites, but the websites are backed by like physical bunkers of bills and like, faxes and phone calls and shit to actually settle everything in the back end. It doesn't work. Like it's not how you would design this system today. And um, and then you have two different countries. So you're trying to send money from one to the other, and they develop completely incompatible systems with each other, and they have no idea how to interface. And like what that sort of like made it clear all of a sudden was like, wait a minute, I would still rather send a Bitcoin there. It's so much easier, right? Because it's one protocol that like the whole world knows how to interface with, open, effective documentation that everyone agrees on. And it settles this question of like, well, then which government gets to control it? The answer is it's an open ledger, right? It's distributed. And it's actually a pretty clever solution to like global transfers and payments, and in a way that like we definitely haven't replicated with anything else. And I think that was sort of like the first I started to realize there was demand for this in the first place. Was when I had to actually deal with the alternative.
Yes, I think everybody has had that experience here. When you go from Bitcoin back to the legacy financial rails, it's so antiquated and difficult, and it's amazing that we lived like that for so long. Of course, former Secretary of State Clinton just said yesterday that Bitcoin is going to basically supplant. She said there's a risk that it will supplant the US dollar as global reserve currency. And I think the fact that the rails, it seems too late for the fiat system to improve enough to compete with Bitcoin. But in terms of this new banking infrastructure and the rails on Bitcoin, what is FTX? Are you involved? What are you doing towards Bitcoin? What are you doing for Bitcoin? Everybody here works for Bitcoin. Are you helping with Lightning or Liquid, introducing those to the exchange on FTX?
We don't have those all looking into it. We do have other like layer 2 solutions for transfers. But I think a big part of this is, right, like when you go to Starbucks and you buy a coffee, right, still using fiat currency, and it's using, I mean, 3% fees on credit cards, stapled on top of God knows what. And why is it that payments don't use cryptocurrencies? And one part of it is the technological aspect, right? One part of it is scaling. Um, but I think probably the biggest problem here is if a customer comes in Bitcoin and the restaurant doesn't accept Bitcoin, then they can't pay it. And if a restaurant accepts Bitcoin but no customer wants to pay in Bitcoin, then there will be no Bitcoin payments. So in order to have transactions using you need both sides to work together, like both buyer and seller, so to speak. And the problems that creates like a quadratic barrier to adoption, right? It's the same network effect barrier that you have social media, where no social media network, no one wants to use it because no one's there. Um, and so one of the big things I think we've been thinking about is how can we basically make it really, really easy for just to start accepting as payments. Not doesn't have to be a big deal, but just be there ready to do it if someone wants to pay for it, and then make it easy for for consumers to spend crypto, and slowly start introducing both of those at once, and eventually hit this threshold effect. I think it's probably around 10 to 20% adoption or something, at which enough of the time both sides meet up and want to use it and start acting. Um, and so a lot of that is dealing with all the existing payment processors, working on both making it easy for you to go from whatever you're in right now to crypto, and for you crypto, whatever payment processor you're using right now.
Right.
And
So
while also trying to create a financial consumer app that really supports crypto natively.
right. I mean, I've spent a few days in Alzante where I did have a tragic surfing accident, so I do have no Bitcoin when I cross the border again. So I use Lightning payments a load of times there. Like, we bought 10 donuts for $1. Like, my mic went out. It was fully integrated into the system, and everybody was native there on the Lightning network, which in that, I was part of that first Lightning torch like 2 or 3 years ago, and the user interface between then and now is just immense. It was so easy. There was zero resistance to it.
Yeah, it's made a ton of progress in the last few years, and these things take time, but that doesn't mean they need to take centuries, right? I think month by month, year by year, we just make the user experience better bit by bit, and eventually, without people realizing it, there can be a tipping point where all of a sudden it's a little bit easier than the alternative, and people start moving.
So in terms of this hyper-Bitcoinization stage, where we're getting to the nation-state level, what about the regulatory environment? Because obviously the way FTX has to set up, it's a problem for regulatory uncertainty around the world. And it is places like Hong Kong and the Caribbean where you have to set up in order to be able to, do the volume of trades that you have to do within a day. But because you have a giant overhead view of what the global regulatory environment is like, is there any sort of movement you see that is really positive or really negative?
There's some of both, but I think net is positive. It's slow. So there's 195 countries in the world. It's a lot of countries, and each one individually is trying to figure out what they're going to do with crypto. It's a massive production, and it's bit by bit, step by step, and the industry is moving faster than people are used to, and that makes it even harder for regulation to catch up. That being said, one thing that's happened over the last year and a half is it's become big enough that the conversation has changed on the regulatory side, and there are some pain points with that, right? That's going to mean way more enforcement actions than there otherwise would be, but that also means way more thought and resources being put into developing regulatory structures that understand it, crypto, and do work with it. And you know, the regulators all understand this. They know it's happening. They know it's going to happening. And in almost every country, there wasn't any talk of banning crypto. Like there was a few years ago, by and large, that talk is stopped. That's not what any of the focus is on. That doesn't mean there's going to be great regulatory structures overnight everywhere. Like it's going to be amazing. Like it's going to be amazing to see what happens eventually, but it's going to be step by step. And a lot of this is just trying to create constructive conversations. Getting industry and regulators together, talking about what are the important things from a regulatory standpoint, how can we solve for those, and what are the things that are important for the industry to be able to function. And I think that like stable coins are a great place to look there. There's been a ton of just lots of absurd bombs thrown back and forth, really messy. Not that much constructive so far, but I think that there's straightforward things that one can do that actually solve for most of what people want, right? Like registration transparency that like ensures that whatever a stablecoin claims is backing their stablecoin is in fact what's backing it. And that if it claims to be a stablecoin, it's 100% backed, and that there's open redemptions. And that just solves for the major systemic risk and consumer protection sides of this without getting in the way of having the open network that's so important to them. And I'm optimistic that we'll get there on a number of fronts with regulatory structures that work reasonably and solve for what needs to be solved for. I think there's positive progress on a lot of agencies' front there. It's going to take time. It's going to be a few years at least.
Now, speaking of regulatory structures around the world, there has been this notion of beginning to tax unrealized gains in the United States. And we kind of relate this to the whole Cantillon effect and the money printing that has seen the extraordinary explosion in the stock market gains and asset prices rising. Now, in terms of I don't mean to bring up your wealth, but I know that can be kind of embarrassing. But, you are. Hello? Okay, sorry. But, you're widely covered as one of the richest guy under 30 years old. But you even before you became that, you were really into charity. Tell us about your ideas on charity. Just talk about that specifically.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, I think the most important thing that I'm going to end up doing, hopefully, is what I can do with what I've made. And there's a lot of things that could be done. And I think you look on the scale of like what you can do to improve your own happiness, and every study shows that tails off quickly. That above sort of an upper middle class living, the gains in happiness are not very large. Because yeah, okay, you buy 10 cars, you're not going to do anything with the 10th car. Like you look at the scale of the world, though, right? I mean, you can spend billions of dollars per year just eradicating one single tropical disease, right? Like the scale of what you can do to help the world is massive. Um, and I think one look at there is neglected diseases be dying out in this day and age. Things like malaria. One thing you can look at is if you sort of expand out to the far future, what's going to make the biggest difference of what type of world for the generations and generations after us, and the things that might play the largest role in the direction that the world takes. And I think one example of this, which I've been thinking about a fair bit recently, is economic preparedness. I think it's become really clear over the last few years that the world has absolutely no idea how to respond to a pandemic. And I think we got kind of lucky that this didn't turn out worse than it did. I mean, COVID is not the most deadly disease ever, and if it were worse, like, I don't think we would have gotten our shit together. Like, I think it just would have been extremely deadly. And that is not good. And I don't think we learned much from this time. Like, I don't feel like if another pandemic came a year from now, we would nail it as a global society. I feel like we would be just more bitter and acrimonious. And, you know, there's sort of like, well, like the most celebrated aspect is, you know, that it only took us like a year and a half to get vaccines rolled out, which is, that's a long time. It's a lot longer than it takes to make a vaccine, right? And like only playing it by a year and a half is not like a great accomplishment. And all of the theories that we rolled out just make no sense in retrospect. Like, remember when like we just went through the phase of like flattening the curve, and like, yeah, we flattened the curve. That's why we're still here today, right? We didn't solve the problem. We didn't move on. We're just in purgatory. And like we just learned lessons, and as so biotech, frankly, as it gets more and more powerful, you know, this could get worse, not better.
Well,
And,
I also feel like, you know, the pandemic and the lockdowns, what they've revealed is a general entropy in the fiat system. These shortages, supply chains are still completely broken, and nobody seems to have any idea what to do about it. And it feels like in the Bitcoin world, all you meet are builders, and they're doing stuff, and they're building stuff, and they just go to El Salvador. You know, the biggest names in Bitcoin are here helping a small vendor of pupusas set up their Lightning network, which is like, it's just a different mindset, it feels like to me, that I prefer this hyper-Bitcoinized world.
I mean, I think one of my favorite stories from the pandemic when some tokens tied to gold started trading at a giant premium to gold because the chain was fucked with, and so the trucks that were carrying the gold from like one vault to another, like couldn't get the drivers, and so you couldn't redeem the tokens anymore because like this supply chain breakdown on gold, and it's I mean it's insane, right? Like this, you know, we've seen what happens when we digitize things; it makes them more efficient, and you know, I think that like the number of partners that we are talking to right now who are asking for contactless digital blockchain-based payments is gone up quite a bit over the last few years.
Okay, well, we only have under 2 minutes left. If you have any last word for El Salvador, you nearly made it here. What do you have to say about what you've seen here, at least through the news?
I mean, like, really excited about what's going on, and I'm really excited to start seeing more adoption of Bitcoin and of crypto. And you know, I think this is just step one. There's an enormous amount to go. There's an enormous amount to explore here. Love to be part of it. I apologize for not making it. My plane had some landing gear issues and was not actually able to what it's supposed to. So I've spent most of the last 2 days in airports. But no, I mean, it's really exciting to see adoption really start, and it's hard to be the first. It's also one of the most valuable things you can do.
Well, you have to come down as soon as your landing gear is fixed. Come for at least the surfing accident, right? Then they won't be able to say you're worth 20-something billion anymore. Just say you lost it all in the sea.
You know, that's I'll try that one.
Well, give it a round of applause to Sam Bankman Fried. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. All right, our next guest is going to be introduced by Rodolfo. Thanks for joining us, and I'll meet you out back later. Anybody want to join me for a surfing accident?
Thanks so much, Stacy. Please.